Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Shelby Miller, and I am a visiting lecturer in applied linguistics at the University of North Texas at Dallas. I am also a TexTESOL 5 board member and currently serve as the technology coordinator. So I just wanted to say thank you on behalf of the board for being with us today, and an extra thanks for joining me for my session entitled Get Them to Talk, Introversion as a Personality Trait and its impact on willingness to communicate. In this session, we're going to explore how to move our introverted students into a willingness to communicate. And what I mean by this is we want to figure out how we can encourage our perhaps innately quieter students to engage in conversation. If you're like me, you have a handful of students in your class that are the last to volunteer to speak and the last to take the initiative to engage in or start a conversation. This behavior is likely justified by their tendency to be quiet and reserved, but we can understand this behavior better by looking at the personality trait of introversion and the role it plays in second language acquisition. So, to accomplish our goal today, in this session, we need to explore three things. We need to gain a thorough understanding of what introversion is and also what it isn't. Secondly, we want to explore the willingness to communicate model in second language acquisition and see how introversion fits inside that framework. Finally, we need to turn to the literature to help us synthesize our understanding of introversion, how it ties into a willingness to communicate, and what we can do in our classroom to support our students. Let's get started by exploring introversion as a personality trait. So, what is a personality trait exactly? Personality traits are, in short, behaviors in individuals that are consistently displayed and predictable. You can make sense of this definition by thinking about these two questions. First, who is a person in your life that you know is likely going to always turn down the opportunity to hang out because they'd prefer to be home? Alternatively, who is a person in your life that you know can enter a crowded room full of strangers and leave that same room with 5 new best friends? I'm guessing these questions brought very specific people to your mind, people who are predictable and consistent enough in their behavior that you could associate them with these questions. This is the lens for which we want to understand introversion, a trait that is predictable and consistent. I am guessing introversion is a term that many of you have at least a general understanding of, so we will build on what you may already know. To start with, in order to look at introversion, we also have to explore its binary trait, extroversion. If you've ever taken the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator or the Big 5 Personality Trait Assessment, you've undoubtedly noticed that introversion and extroversion are one dimension of personality that is regularly assessed. By the way, if you have not taken one of these assessments before, I provided a link to a free personality assessment at the end of this presentation. So, introversion and extroversion are binary traits, meaning you are either one or the other. And yes, people can operate at times in the middle or move back and forth between the two, but the reality is that you and your students gravitate towards one. One is more predictable of you, and one is more consistently displayed by you. As we dive into these two terms, I first wanted to share this visual aid for understanding their differences. On the left, we see the inner workings of an introvert, someone who has many thoughts, but shares very few of them, as you can tell by the single speech bubble leaving their mouth. On the right, we have the extrovert, someone who shares very many thoughts and keeps very few thoughts to themselves. What they have in common is the propensity to think and react to the world around them. The reaction, though, manifests differently. So let's dive into these further. Many labels are used to describe introverts, such as quiet and shy. In surveys, some have described introverts also as unfriendly. And if you are an introvert, hold tight. I am by no means making the claim that introverts are unfriendly. While some of these labels might have some truth, Others are far from accurately reflecting and describing the trait of introversion. These 3 labels, for example, do not actually describe introversion. They describe byproducts of introversion. They only describe what people perceive introverts are doing. Introversion is not necessarily best viewed by these labels, though quiet and shy might be helpful indicators for working to identify introverts in your classroom. But as we saw from the image on the previous screen, and I will reinforce that here, introversion is all about how someone prefers to react to the world. And the preference is to react internally. An introvert doesn't prefer to react shy. An introvert just simply prefers to think before reacting, if they want to react at all. And I can illustrate that this way. Take a very basic greeting. So you're an introvert walking along a sidewalk, and someone who walks past you says hello. Now, remember, I defined introversion on the prior slide as the preference to react internally first to the external world. So in your external world, someone has said hello, and your reaction as an introvert is not necessarily to jump at the response. In fact, the first thing you do is retreat inside and think. And in your head, whether explicitly or implicitly, you think, they said hello. I don't know this person. They greeted me though, and I should greet them back out of politeness. Then you say, hello. So with this example, I'm demonstrating to you what introversion actually is. It is not necessarily shyness. It is not unfriendly. It's prioritizing the time to think before speaking. Conversely, let's look at the same interaction from an extroverted standpoint. With our extrovert, we get the immediate external response of, hello, how are you? Possibly followed by the internal thought of, did I know them? What I'm illustrating here is how extroversion manifests differently. Specifically, an extrovert reacts to the external world by producing another external reaction, unlike the introvert, whose first reaction to the same situation is to go internal. So let's clear up our understanding of extroversion while we're looking at it. We can certainly use labels to describe extroversion, as we saw that we use labels to describe introversion. And again, these labels are simply byproducts of how this person is reacting to the world. We saw that introverts react by retreating to their internal world first. And we see here that extroverts react by putting more out into their external world. So, as a byproduct of extroversion, we seemingly see them as more talkative because talking is an external expression. So in light of this information, when it comes to second language learning, let's stop and ask ourselves real quick. Who do you think will have more success acquiring and using their target language, introverts or extroverts? Let's keep this question in mind because we're going to return to this question a little later. When we think about introversion in our classroom, you might be surprised to know that at least 1/3 of your students are introverts. And this number might be even higher if you are working with students that come from other cultures and countries where introversion is highly valued. This has been found to be the case in many Asian countries, that introversion is seen as a highly respectable, sophisticated quality. However, in our culture, extroversion tends to be highly valued instead. So even more interesting is that most educators in the K through 12 system here in the United States are also introverts. So the reality is that this presentation might actually be describing tendencies many of you, my fellow educators, had as young students. So now that we know what introversion is, and we know that we have students who process like this in our classroom, let's explore how this connects to second language acquisition. Introversion connects us to second language acquisition theory, to the theory of willingness to communicate. And this theory upholds that language learners who are willing to communicate, in other words, open to communicating, are going to seek opportunities to do so, and therefore are set up to succeed and advance in their target language. Thus, our goal as educators is to use the language learning process to drive and encourage our students towards a willingness to communicate. And to do that, we need to understand the factors that influence a student's willingness to communicate. This leads us to exploring the willingness to communicate framework, which I have here on the screen in front of you. This framework serves to describe, explain, and predict second language communication. So this pyramid aims to describe the complex variables that either motivate a student towards a willingness to communicate or towards an unwillingness to communicate. And this model can be used to address pedagogical concerns such as why some students speak in class and some don't. Let's turn our focus to the bottom of the pyramid. Here at the bottom of the pyramid, we have what are considered enduring influences. These are the underlying factors that consistently motivate a student towards or away from pursuing communication opportunities. These are also factors that remain consistent in the learner across contexts. These factors include things like age, gender, and culture, and social identities. We're not able to explore the entire model in this presentation, but there is one aspect of this that is really important to us, circled on the bottom right of this pyramid, and that is personality. Now, admittedly, I was shocked to find personality listed on this model when I came across it several years ago. And that is because so much of our training as educators is focused on the sociocultural differences in our students or their cognitive and learning differences. And we can find a ton of research weighing in on how these factors do indeed influence our students in the language learning environment. But the amount of literature focusing on the role of personality in the language learning process is relatively very small compared to these other variables. Yet, there it is. It sits right in front of us as an important foundational facet of our students that we need to attend to in the classroom. So let's start connecting together the evidence we have here with what we know about introversion. So from here, we want to draw what we know about introversion to the willingness to communicate framework. And the research does in fact show that introverts are unwilling to communicate, which, as you can assume, has immediate implications on their performance not only in your classroom, but also in environments where they might otherwise use their target language. In all of this literature, another bit of insightful evidence emerged regarding introverts and a tendency towards having lower self-esteem. And if we return to our WTC model, we can actually see here that we perhaps have another potential byproduct of introversion that is going to further impede their willingness to communicate. And that's the self-confidence level, just 2 tiers up from personality. But we want to clarify something about this bit of research. What the research found is that introversion, coupled with other personality traits, can lead a student to having lower self-esteem. But I said earlier in this presentation that we want to not only explore what introversion is, we also want to explore what it isn't. So here is what introversion isn't. Introversion is not the same thing as anxiety. Introversion does not necessarily mean shy. Introversion does not mean lack of confidence. Introversion is a personality trait that doesn't need fixed or counseled. Introversion is a way in which people prefer to process information, and that's all it is. So the fact it's linked here in some studies with lower self-esteem really needs unpacked. And the reality is that when it's linked, when introversion's coupled with other personality traits, very specific ones, yes, lower self-esteem can manifest in that student. But we can't look at introversion alone as meaning the student has lower self-esteem. So now we've discussed that introversion is this preference to react to the world internally. We've also discussed that many of the labels we have put on introverts don't necessarily align or accurately explain the linguistic behavior that introverts have. So when we discuss the correlation between introversion and their speech production, or the speech production of our students, we don't want to rely on society's labels of shy, for example. We want to turn to what research can tell us. And lucky for us, research has been done on this topic. And what we've seen is that introverts do indeed talk less than extroverts. I bet you're not surprised, right? We also found a wealth of other differences between introverts and extroverts regarding language use. But pertinent to our topic today is the fact that introverts will talk less than extroverts. And as we saw in the willingness to communicate model, personality, in this case introversion, is a facet of our students that is going to remain consistent in our students across contexts. And we can see that supported by these studies who have studied introverts in a variety of contexts, in a variety of situations, such as placing them in a room with a random person and essentially asking them to shoot the breeze. And they would record these interactions, and guess what? They found at the end of these interactions, introverts talked less than the extroverts. Or even interviewing an introvert and asking them to describe something like a picture. Comparatively, across all these contexts, introverts produce less speech than extroverts. In another study, introverts were also found to advance at a slower rate in pragmatic competence. And in the case of this study, with specifically the competence had to do with incorporating politeness when using request speech acts. So this finding is interesting for the purpose of our conversation because what it theorized in the end is that the introverted students who were unwilling to communicate were rarely afforded the opportunity to learn to apply politeness practices in authentic conversation. Whereas the extroverts in this study reported having practiced speech acts like requests in real interactions. So first thing is, none of these studies suggest that introverts fit the labels we saw earlier of being shy or unfriendly. Instead, we explored these linguistic choices having the knowledge that the introvert is spending more time in their head reflecting than they are externally expressing themselves. So now we arrive at where we wanted to be. We have an understanding of introversion as a personality trait. We know that personality plays a crucial role in a student's willingness to communicate. We also know from literature how introversion manifests itself in linguistic production and thus leads to an unwillingness to communicate. The question is now, how do we get them to talk? Or more specifically, how do we motivate them out of a place of being unwilling to communicate? Well, to answer that question, we first need to know the goal. The goal, first and foremost, is not to turn introverts into extroverts. Specifically, the aim is not to make your introverted students turn into extroverted students, especially into L2 extroverts. It will not happen. Because remember, introversion is not a problem, the same way we would see self-doubt and anxiety as problems. Introversion is a personality type, and it doesn't need fixed. It needs understood and motivated. The goal, though, is to help L1 introverts express themselves as competent L2 introverts. And as I pointed out earlier, our society tends to value extroversion. So there is a lot of reward in the classroom typically for those that are extroverts. And a lot of tasks and classroom activities are actually built in such a way that they implicitly reward or benefit the extroverted student over the introverted student. With that said, the answers to our question are not entirely surprising, but they do invite us to rethink the classroom. On the next slide, I'll give you a little more detail as to things you can prioritize in the classroom to draw your introverts into communicating. But first, I wanted to encourage you to rethink what type of activities you reward in your classroom. And the reward might be something that is graded, or something where you literally reward students with small prizes, Or perhaps the reward is unspoken, but you prioritize and value students who can perform in these type of activities that you offer. I put reward in quotes because it may not be something that the students are explicitly rewarded for, but perhaps you are inclined to build certain activities around personal preferences you have. Some of this is speaking from my own personal experience, and some of it is from consolidating the literature in light of what we know about introversion. But it is possible that you might reward extroversion in your classroom more than introversion. I've seen a lot of classrooms use first to respond activities, right? Here's my question, raise your hand and answer as quickly as possible. Or other activities that create urgency in speaking. I also know that at times we may spontaneously put students in a speaking position, whether that is calling on them to answer a question or spontaneously asking students to present on something or tell us about something they had just done yesterday or over the weekend. How many times do you put your students to work in small groups and you ask them to partner with someone new as opposed to someone they already know? So these types of activities, I want to clarify, absolutely have value. So I'm not drawing attention to them as flawed. What I am drawing out of you, though, is that when we consider how introversion works in our students, how can activities like these move them into a willingness to communicate when the opportunity to reflect isn't afforded to them first? Do you have a classroom that implicitly prioritizes and rewards extroversions, students who are more inclined to jump at opportunities to communicate? So the next question would be, what can I do to reward introversion? Or present my introverts with opportunities that may motivate their willingness to communicate? The items on this list might not be a shock or astound you, especially if you're an introvert, because you're reading these things and thinking, yes, I'd much rather be in that classroom experience myself. What I have here are action items for you to consider in order to help your introverted students turn into competent introverted L2 speakers that are willing to communicate inside that space. First, my first suggestion is let them work in a comfortable environment. That could be a physical environment, such as letting them sit next to a friend in class, but it could also be the environment or the overall atmosphere of the class, meaning can they come to class and be themselves? Secondly, allow them to work with people they know. There is certainly value in mixing up groups, but the moment you throw an introvert in with someone new, a new external world stimulus, right? Where are they going to retreat? Inside. It's part of their process. So depending on the activity, if having them communicate is the top priority, this is more likely to be achieved when they have the opportunity to work with someone they are comfortable with. Thirdly, when assignments are customizable, allow them to speak or write about hobbies or activities that interest them. This is because they've already reflected on those items. So they are more apt to share verbally on topics that they've already internally explored. Next, when possible, pre-plan speaking activities. So even the small ones, and I know you probably do this with speeches and your larger activities, but even the small ones. So for example, tomorrow I'm going to ask you to share something about your weekend. So let them have time to think about it before they need to speak about it, as opposed to saying, hey, when in 5 minutes, everyone's going to share their weekend with me. We're going to give them a little more time to think about that. Next, if you do have spontaneous activities in class, because again, those are valuable, consider allowing for written follow-up opportunities. So this will allow them to reflect on the activity and contribute in their own way using the target language after that reflection time. So if it's a spontaneous activity and it's alienating some introverts from participating, this will allow them to engage in that activity with that reflection gap. The next one ties into our last slide, which is balance social activities with quiet times. Again, if you are like me and perhaps mistakenly prioritize extroversion in the classroom, consider balancing these type of activities with solo quiet time, allowing your introvert to have time to think, reflect, and gain some of their energy back from the social interaction. Finally, probably something I do not have to tell anyone in here, but one common mistake that can be made or that their peers can make is interrupting them. When they are willing to communicate, let them operate in that space without interruption, which will help reinforce that interest in communication. And if it is an introvert who happens to have lower self-esteem, it will help build some of that competency. Earlier, I posed a question for you to consider, which was, who do you think will have more success acquiring and using their target language, introverts or extroverts? And even though after what we've explored today, we might feel overwhelmingly inclined to say extroverts, the actual answer is both can succeed. They just bring completely different skills to the table. The research actually shows that introverts are likely going to perform better at the academic demands that accompany the language learning experience. And they're likely to perform better at memory-related tasks, for example, vocabulary list. Conversely, though, and to our point today, they are not as likely as extroverts to actually seek opportunities to engage in the target language. So here's where extroverts are more naturally inclined to advance quicker in their language skills compared to introverts. But again, the answer to this question is that both introverts and extroverts have an equal opportunity to acquire and gain proficiency in their target language. We just have to know how to address each personality trait for the individual difference that it is. So what are your personality traits? As promised earlier, for those that are interested, here is a link that will take you to a free personality assessment. It's not technically the Myers-Briggs type indicator, but it performs similarly, and it's a great starting point to learn about yourself. It is not an assessment that I recommend you give your students unless they are very proficient in English. I am presently working on a personality assessment that would be good for measuring introversion and extroversion in beginner to intermediate English language speakers, but it isn't quite done yet. On a final note, I wanted to invite you all to check out my alma mater, Texas A&M University Commerce, who is one of our sponsors today. They have a master's in applied linguistics with emphasis in TESOL, and it is an excellent program. Their website is on the screen, but be sure to check out their virtual exhibitor booth with us on the WOVA app. Today they have a raffle. You can enter for a chance to win a free application waiver for the program, and they have information on grants for Texas educators that are interested in pursuing their graduate degree. So check them out. Thank you again for your time today, and please let me know if you have any questions.